I've been married to Stephanie for 7 years. When we first met, she was this ambitious pharmaceutical sales rep, climbing her way up the corporate ladder, always talking about her 5-year plans and quarterly targets. I genuinely admired that drive, that fire in her eyes when she'd discuss landing the next big account, or outselling her regional competition. Meanwhile, I was deep in the trenches of what she'd later call just being a mechanic. But here's what Stephanie never bothered to learn about her husband. While she was busy networking at fancy hotel conferences and collecting LinkedIn connections, I was building something real with my hands and my brain. Started as an apprentice at Murphy's Auto Repair when I was 19, straight out of high school. No college degree, no fancy business courses, just me, a toolbox, and an old-timer named Murphy, who taught me that fixing things properly the first time builds more than just engines. It builds reputation. Murphy was 67 when I walked into his shop that first day, all grease-stained overalls and weathered hands that could diagnose an engine problem just by listening to it idle. He'd been running that place for 32 years, watching Phoenix grow from a desert outpost into a sprawling metropolitan area. The shop sat on a corner lot in the industrial district, surrounded by warehouses and freight companies, the kind of neighborhood where honest work got respected and bullshit got called out immediately. "You ever work on cars before, kid?" Murphy asked me the first morning, not looking up from the transmission he had spread across his workbench like pieces of a mechanical puzzle. "Some," I lied. Truth was, I'd changed oil in my dad's driveway and replaced a few belts, but nothing that qualified as real experience. But I needed that job, and something about Murphy's direct manner told me he'd respect honesty over credentials. He handed me a wrench and pointed to a busted radiator. "Fix that. Don't break anything else while you're at it." 3 years later, Murphy wanted to retire, had no kids, no family to pass the business to. His wife had died 2 years earlier, and the shop was all he had left of a lifetime spent building something meaningful. He offered to sell me the operation for what I could scrape together, plus a payment plan that would have made a loan shark blush. $28,000 down, then monthly payments that would eat up most of my income for the next 5 years. Stephanie thought I was completely insane. We'd been dating for about 8 months by then, and she was already making decent money in pharmaceutical sales, pulling down maybe $45,000 annually. She couldn't understand why I'd want to take on that kind of debt for what she called a dead-end job. "Brady, honey, you're smart enough to do something better than this," she said, sitting across from me at that little Mexican place we used to frequent before she developed more expensive tastes. "Why don't you go back to school, get a business degree? You could work for a real company, maybe in management or something." I tried explaining that I wasn't just buying a job, I was buying a business. That Murphy's customer base was solid, loyal people who'd been coming there for decades because they knew they'd get fair prices and honest work. That the location was prime for expansion, with industrial development happening all around us. That I could see opportunities she couldn't imagine. But Stephanie heard what she wanted to hear. Her boyfriend was a mechanic who was foolishly going into debt to stay a mechanic. She never asked about the numbers, never wanted to see the financial projections I'd worked out, never bothered to understand the difference between owning a business and working for one. That first shop in Phoenix's industrial district became my proving ground. 12-hour days, grease under my fingernails, learning not just how to fix cars, but how to run a business, customer service, inventory management, hiring good techs, building relationships with parts suppliers, real business skills, not PowerPoint presentations and buzzword bingo. The work was hard, but it was honest. When Mrs. Rodriguez brought in her ancient Honda with 200,000 miles, she knew I'd tell her the truth about whether it was worth fixing or if she needed to start shopping for something newer. When the construction crews from the development projects needed fleet maintenance, they knew I'd get their trucks back on the road fast, without gouging them on labor costs. Within 2 years, I'd paid off Murphy and had enough saved to eye a second location. The automotive repair business in Phoenix was booming thanks to the population growth and the harsh desert conditions that were murder on vehicles. People needed reliable service, and they were willing to pay for it if you proved yourself trustworthy. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. A struggling shop in the Camelback Road corridor was going under, victim of poor management and an owner who'd rather drink beer than rebuild engines. The location was perfect, high traffic, good visibility, right in the path of Phoenix's northwestern expansion. The asking price was reasonable because the previous owner was desperate. Stephanie was pulling down better money by then, maybe $60,000 annually with bonuses. So she never questioned where I was finding cash for expansion. She assumed I was barely breaking even, maybe taking on more debt to play businessman. The truth was I was pulling in more profit from those first 2 shops than she made in salary, but I kept that information to myself. Why didn't I tell her? Part of it was genuine curiosity. I wanted to see if my wife would respect me for who I was, not what my bank account looked like. Another part was pure stubbornness. I didn't want admiration that came from dollar signs. And honestly, I was testing her, watching how far she'd take her assumptions about my limitations. The pattern was set. Stephanie would achieve something at work and come home excited, then immediately pivot to asking when I was going to get serious about my future. The real expansion started around year 4 of our marriage. By then, I had 6 locations strategically positioned across the Phoenix metropolitan area, and I was quietly becoming one of the larger independent auto repair operations in Arizona. Each shop had its own personality, its own customer base, but they all operated under the same principles Murphy had taught me: honest work, fair prices, and treating people with respect, regardless of what they drove. The Camelback Road location became my flagship operation. I had invested in state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment, hired 3 certified techs, and built a customer waiting area that actually looked professional. Word spread fast in that neighborhood. When you find a mechanic you can trust, you tell everyone you know. Soon I was handling maintenance contracts for local businesses, fleet vehicles for construction companies, even some high-end imports for the wealthy folks living in the Biltmore area. But it wasn't just automotive repair anymore. I'd started buying real estate. Nothing fancy at first, just solid rental properties in working-class neighborhoods where people understood the value of honest landlords who kept their word. A duplex here, a small apartment complex there, always in areas where I knew the demographic and could judge the long-term potential. My attorney, a sharp woman named Linda Vasquez, who'd helped me structure the business purchases, suggested forming an LLC for the real estate investments. Keep your automotive business separate from your property holdings, she advised. Different liability profiles, different tax advantages. Plus, it gives you more privacy if you want to stay under the radar. Privacy. That word stuck with me, especially as Stephanie's career continued its upward trajectory, and her attitude toward my work became increasingly condescending. She'd been promoted to regional sales director for her pharmaceutical company, completing an executive MBA program through Arizona State, pulling down $95,000 a year plus performance bonuses that sometimes pushed her total compensation over 6 figures. And she was starting to act like it. "Brady, you need to start thinking about your image," she said one evening, sitting at our kitchen table with her laptop open, probably reviewing quarterly sales projections. "I'm networking with some pretty important people now, and when they ask what my husband does..." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. What could I say? That I owned 6 profitable businesses? That my gross revenue was approaching 7 figures annually? That I was building a real estate portfolio while she was worried about impressing people whose names she'd forget in 6 months? Instead, I nodded and asked if she wanted me to pick up dinner on my way home from the shop tomorrow. She smiled that patient smile she'd perfected, the one that said she appreciated my willingness to contribute in my limited capacity. The breaking point came last spring at Stephanie's promotion party. She'd landed a vice president track position, and her company rented out this resort in Scottsdale for the celebration. The kind of place with imported marble in the bathrooms and waiters who'd been trained to make you feel like royalty while separating you from your money. All of Stephanie's colleagues were there, plus their spouses, plus some corporate executives who'd flown in from the company's headquarters back east. I showed up in my best shirt and tie, genuinely proud of her accomplishment. She'd worked hard for this opportunity and deserved the recognition. The conversation flowed around topics I understood, but wasn't supposed to contribute to: market penetration strategies, regulatory compliance challenges, competitive positioning in the pharmaceutical landscape. I stood near the bar, nursing a beer that cost more than some people make in an hour, watching my wife work the room like the seasoned professional she'd become. She was good at it, I had to admit. Confident without being aggressive, knowledgeable without being condescending, charming without seeming fake. These were real skills, valuable skills, and she'd earned her place in that room through years of dedication and smart career moves. Then her mother, Amanda, decided it was time for a toast. Amanda had always been a force of nature, the kind of woman who'd married well, raised successful children, and never let anyone forget either accomplishment. She raised her crystal champagne flute high and announced loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear, to Stephanie for finally reaching the level where she can support both herself and Brady properly. The pause that followed felt like it lasted forever. Every conversation stopped. Every eye in the room found me, standing there in my off-the-rack suit, holding my beer like some kind of prop in Amanda's performance. Maybe now she can afford to get him into some real career training, Amanda continued, apparently just warming up. It's never too late to make something of yourself, Brady. Stephanie's shown you what's possible when you apply yourself to something meaningful. The room erupted in polite laughter, the kind that's more uncomfortable than cruel, but cuts just as deep. Not everyone joined in, but enough people did to make it clear that Amanda was saying what some of them had been thinking. The pharmaceutical sales crowd, the MBA graduates, the people who measured success in titles and corner offices and quarterly performance reviews. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was watching Stephanie's face as her mother spoke. She wasn't embarrassed by Amanda's comments. She wasn't rushing to defend her husband or correct any misunderstandings about his capabilities. She was nodding along, wearing that same patient smile she gave me at home when I didn't understand something important about her work. Then Stephanie herself spoke up, and the room fell silent again. Seriously, Brady, maybe it's time to get a real job. Stop playing with cars and get serious about providing for a family. The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Stop playing with cars and get serious about providing for a family. My wife had just dismissed everything I'd built, everything I'd accomplished, in front of a room full of strangers who now remember me as the unsuccessful husband who needed to get his act together. The silence that followed was deafening. Her colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their expensive suits, a few nervous coughs breaking the tension, but nobody said a word. Someone's spouse muttered something about tough love, but it felt hollow, like they were trying to fill an awkward void rather than actually defend me. I could have spoken up right then. Could have told them about the 6 auto repair shops generating more revenue than most of their salaries combined. Could have mentioned the real estate portfolio, the business expansion plans, the fact that I was building something real while they were all dancing around conference tables talking about market penetration and strategies for overpriced medications. Instead, I did something that surprised everyone in that room, including myself. I smiled. Not the weak apologetic smile of a man who'd been put in his place, but a genuine smile of recognition. Because in that moment, standing there with every assumption about my life laid bare for public consumption, I realized something important. Stephanie had no idea who she was married to. After 7 years together, she'd constructed an entire narrative about my limitations, my lack of ambition, my failure to reach my potential. And I'd let her build that story, brick by brick, without ever correcting the foundation it was built on. The drive home was silent. Stephanie stared out the passenger window while I navigated the winding roads back from Scottsdale, both of us lost in our own thoughts. When we pulled into our driveway, she finally spoke. "You're not angry?" she asked, sounding almost disappointed. "No," I said honestly. "I'm not angry." And I wasn't. Anger would have meant I still cared what those people thought, that their opinion of my worth mattered somehow. But sitting there in my truck, looking at the house I'd been paying for with money from businesses she didn't think existed, I felt something closer to clarity than rage. That night, after Stephanie had gone to bed, I sat in my home office reviewing financial statements and property listings. The automotive business was solid, growing steadily, but I'd been conservative about expansion. Maybe too conservative. Real estate, though, that was where the real opportunity lay. Phoenix was exploding, growing faster than the infrastructure could keep up with, and commercial properties in the right locations were appreciating at ridiculous rates. 3 months later, I did something that would change everything. Through my attorney and the LLC she'd helped me establish, I quietly purchased a 22-floor office building in the downtown Phoenix. The seller was motivated, a California investment group that had overextended themselves in multiple markets and needed to liquidate assets quickly. The asking price was below market value, and I had the liquid capital from years of profitable operations across all my businesses. The building wasn't just any commercial property. It housed the regional headquarters for Stephanie's pharmaceutical company, along with several other professional service firms, a law practice, and some smaller medical device companies. 22 floors of Class A commercial real estate. And my wife went to work there every single day without knowing her husband owned the ground she walked on. The purchase had been strategic on multiple levels. The existing leases were solid, long-term agreements with reputable companies, guaranteeing steady income for years. The location was prime, close to the financial district, easy freeway access, surrounded by the kind of development that attracts high-paying tenants. But beyond the pure investment logic, there was something else driving the decision. I wanted to see what would happen when Stephanie had to deal with a landlord who ran his properties like actual businesses instead of passive investment vehicles, someone who expected tenants to follow lease terms, maintain professional standards, and respect the fact that commercial real estate was a business relationship, not a charity operation. My attorney, Linda, handled all the paperwork through the LLC, keeping my name off anything Stephanie might accidentally encounter during her daily routine. The transaction was clean, legal, and completely invisible to her world. As far as she knew, some faceless investment company had bought the building from another faceless investment company. 2 weeks after closing, I made my first executive decision as building owner. Through Crystal Rodriguez, the property management company I'd hired to handle day-to-day operations, I authorized a modest rent increase for all tenants. Nothing aggressive, nothing punitive, just a standard market adjustment that brought all the leases up to current commercial rates. Crystal had come highly recommended by Linda, a former corporate real estate executive who'd started her own property management firm after getting tired of working for companies that treated buildings like spreadsheet entries instead of business assets. She was professional, discreet, and understood exactly what I was looking for in a management partner. The pharmaceutical company lease is actually below market, Crystal told me during our first meeting in her downtown office. Previous ownership was apparently pretty passive about rate adjustments. Bringing them up to current standards is well within normal business practices. The rent increase notice went out on a Tuesday morning. That evening, Stephanie came home carrying her frustration like a heavy briefcase. "Our building got sold to some property investment group," she announced, dropping her purse by the door with more force than necessary. And of course, the first thing they do is jack up our rent. Typical. I was in the kitchen, reviewing inventory reports from the Camelback Road shop, but I looked up with appropriate concern. How much of an increase? Enough to matter. Our facility's budget was already tight, and now we have to deal with some greedy landlord squeezing more money out of hard-working tenants. I offered to help review their lease agreement, maybe spot any loopholes or unfair terms that might give them some negotiating leverage. Stephanie laughed, that particular laugh she'd perfected over the years. Not quite condescending, but close enough to sting. "Brady, honey, this is commercial real estate law, not carburetor repair, but thanks for offering." She patted my shoulder the way you'd pat a well-meaning child who'd volunteered to help with calculus homework. "I'll handle the business side of things." That stung, but I let it slide. The game was just beginning, and I had the patience to play it properly. Over the next few months, I watched Stephanie navigate the realities of having a landlord who ran his properties like actual businesses rather than passive investment vehicles. When the air conditioning system needed upgrading in their building, Crystal coordinated professional installation with fair pricing but firm timelines. When they requested modifications to their office layout for a departmental restructuring, we approved reasonable changes while maintaining building standards and requiring proper permits. Each interaction was professional, by the book, and completely transparent. No special favors, no corner cutting, but also no unreasonable demands or arbitrary restrictions. Just the kind of property management that respects both tenant needs and owner interests. But Stephanie experienced it differently. She'd come home frustrated with their demanding property management company, complaining about landlords who act like they're running some high-end operation instead of just renting office space. "Just office space," she'd say, scrolling through emails on her phone while I cooked dinner. "They want documentation for every little change, professional contractors for simple maintenance requests, formal approval processes for things that should be automatic. Just office space. 22 floors of Class A commercial real estate that I'd bought with cash, accumulated from these. Car repair hobby, she thought, was keeping us barely afloat financially. The irony was almost too perfect. Stephanie, who prided herself on understanding business operations and professional standards, was frustrated by a landlord who actually maintained professional standards. She wanted the benefits of prime commercial real estate, without the responsibilities that came with occupying it. Maybe you should set up a meeting with this property management company, I suggested one evening, watching her sort through building-related correspondence at our kitchen table. Explain your company's position. Try to build a better working relationship. She looked up from the papers, considering the idea. You know what? That's actually not a bad suggestion. Sometimes these property management people are more reasonable when you approach them professionally instead of just complaining about every policy. 3 weeks later, Stephanie announced she was going to drive over to the building on Saturday morning to meet with the property manager in person. She'd scheduled an appointment through the management company's office, hoping to establish better communication and maybe negotiate more flexibility on some of the building policies that were affecting her company's operations. I'm going to find out who's really behind all these policy changes, she declared, adjusting her blazer in the hallway mirror before leaving that morning. These property management companies usually front for individual investors who don't understand how real businesses operate. I told her I had work to do at the Camelback Road shop and would probably be there most of the day. She kissed my cheek and said she hoped I'd have a productive day fixing cars. An hour later, I positioned myself in Crystal's office, dressed in khakis and a polo shirt that looked appropriately professional but not overly formal. When Stephanie walked through the building's front doors at exactly 10 a.m., I watched through the office window as she approached the reception desk and asked to speak with someone about building ownership and management policies. The receptionist, following Crystal's instructions, directed her to the management office on the second floor. I took the elevator up ahead of her, positioned myself in Crystal's office, and waited for what would either be the most satisfying conversation of my marriage or the beginning of its final chapter. Crystal handled the introduction perfectly. When Stephanie knocked on the office door, she invited her in with professional courtesy and appropriate formality. Mrs. Sullivan, thank you for coming in. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us directly. Crystal gestured toward the conference table where I was sitting with a folder of documents in front of me. I believe you wanted to discuss building policies and ownership structure. She paused, letting Stephanie settle into the chair across from us. I'd like you to meet the building owner, Brady Sullivan. For a moment that felt like it lasted forever. My wife didn't process what she was seeing. Her brain couldn't reconcile the image of her car mechanic husband sitting in a property management office, being introduced as the owner of the building where she worked every day. I watched confusion, then recognition, then complete shock wash across her face in slow motion. Brady, she said, voice barely above a whisper. What are you doing here? I own this building, I said simply, keeping my tone neutral and professional. Have for about 8 months now. She stared at me like I'd just announced I was secretly an astronaut or spoke fluent Mandarin. You own... What do you mean you own this building? I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the folder I'd prepared for this moment. Property deed with my name clearly visible, purchase agreement showing the cash transaction, LLC formation documents, profit and loss statements from my automotive operations, real estate portfolio summary, bank statements showing the account balances that had made the purchase possible. Everything laid out in clear, undeniable black and white. 7 years of assumptions, 7 years of condescending comments about my lack of ambition, 7 years of being treated like the unsuccessful husband who needed to get serious about providing for his family, all of it contradicted by documents that couldn't be argued with or explained away. Stephanie picked up the property deed first, studying it like she was trying to decode a foreign language. When she looked up at me from those financial statements showing gross revenues she'd never imagined, showing profit margins that dwarfed her pharmaceutical salary, showing a business empire built from the dead-end job she'd been mocking for years, there were tears in her eyes. The garage is, she said quietly, voice barely steady. You actually built something. 12 locations now, I replied, keeping my tone matter of fact. Plus the rental properties. Crystal manages most of the day-to-day operations for the real estate side, but I handle the strategic decisions and major tenant relationships. She was quiet for a long time, studying the bank statements that showed cash reserves larger than her annual salary, studying the business expansion timeline that revealed systematic growth over 7 years, while she'd assumed I was barely staying afloat. Finally, she looked up at Crystal, then back at me, her expression cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and something that might have been recognition. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. "I wasn't planning anything," I said honestly. "I was just building a business while you decided I wasn't worth taking seriously. When your company needed to renew their lease, I made a business decision based on the property's investment potential and location." She nodded slowly, but I could see her mind working, processing implications, understanding for the first time that every conversation about my lack of ambition had been taking place while I was generating more income than she'd ever imagined. Every comment about getting serious, every suggestion that I learned to think bigger, every assumption about my limitations, all of it happening while I was quietly building exactly the kind of success she claimed to value. The drive home was silent. Stephanie stared out the passenger window while I navigated Saturday afternoon traffic, both of us processing the complete realignment of everything we'd thought we knew about our relationship. The financial documents sat in a manila folder on her lap, like evidence in a case that had just been solved. That evening, we had the conversation that had been building for 7 years. She apologized for the assumptions, for the condescending comments, for never asking deeper questions about my work, or bothering to understand the difference between being an employee and owning a business. I acknowledged that I'd let her build those assumptions, that I could have corrected her perspective at any point and chosen not to. "But why didn't you?" she asked, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where she'd spent years explaining why I needed to think bigger. "Why let me believe you were struggling when you were actually succeeding?" "Because I wanted to know if you'd love me for who I was," I said. "Not for what I'd built or how much money I made. I wanted to see if my wife would respect me when she thought I had nothing to offer except myself." She was quiet for a long time, absorbing the weight of what that meant. 7 years of failing a test she didn't know she was taking. 7 years of measuring her husband's worth against external markers of success and finding him lacking, while the actual measures of his success remained invisible to her because she'd never bothered to look. But we both recognized that something fundamental had broken between us during those years. She'd spent too much time diminishing my achievements to colleagues and family, too many dinner parties where she'd apologized for my lack of ambition, too many conversations where she'd positioned herself as the successful spouse carrying the financial burden. I'd spent too much time watching her dismiss everything I'd accomplished, too many moments biting my tongue while she explained my limitations to people who didn't know better. The damage wasn't malicious, but it was deep. Trust, once cracked, doesn't heal just because new information becomes available. Respect, once lost, can't be restored simply by adjusting the financial statements. We tried counseling, tried dating each other again, like strangers who'd met at a coffee shop, instead of spouses who'd accumulated 7 years of resentment. Some things improved. She started asking about my businesses with genuine interest, learning about profit margins and expansion strategies and the complexities of managing multiple operations across different market segments. I shared financial information and decision-making processes I'd kept private, explaining the logic behind property acquisitions and business growth strategies. But we couldn't undo those years of accumulated misunderstanding. She couldn't forget how long I'd let her think I was failing when I was actually building something substantial. I couldn't forget how easily she'd dismissed my potential, how quickly she'd assumed that manual work meant limited intelligence or ambition. 6 months later, we separated amicably. She found a position with another pharmaceutical company in a different building, avoiding the awkwardness of renting office space from her ex-husband. I continued expanding my automotive operations, adding 3 more locations and branching into commercial fleet maintenance contracts. We still text occasionally, checking in on each other's lives with the kind of distant warmth reserved for people who used to love each other, but learned too much about each other's character to continue. The building lease with her former company renewed at standard market rates. Professional relationship, nothing personal. Sometimes people ask if I regret not telling her earlier, if transparency might have changed the trajectory of our marriage. Maybe, but I learned something valuable about character during those years of silence. Success isn't just about building wealth. It's about building respect for the people who matter to you, regardless of what they can do for you in return. Stephanie was brilliant, ambitious, and driven. She deserved all the professional success she'd earned through hard work and strategic career moves. But she'd never learned to see value in work that didn't come with a college degree and a corporate title. That limitation was hers to carry, not mine to fix. I'm doing fine these days. 15 locations now, expanding into commercial fleet maintenance contracts that bring steady revenue from construction companies and delivery services. The real estate portfolio keeps growing steadily, commercial properties in Phoenix's development corridors that appreciate faster than residential investments. I've got a solid crew of managers and technicians who understand that honest work builds more than just bank accounts. It builds character, reputation, and the kind of success that doesn't depend on impressing people at cocktail parties. And I never have to wonder whether someone respects me for my character or my financial statements. The answer's usually pretty clear from the beginning if you're paying attention to the right signals. That clarity, painful as it was to earn, feels like the most valuable thing I built during those years of watching and waiting, worth more than all the garages and properties combined.